Hey everyone, happy second to last week of remote learning. Woohoo! You're almost there and I'm so excited for you. I can't wait for summer so that you guys can have a nice reprieve and a break. Air high five, you earned it and it's going to be awesome. So let's finish strong, let's finish well, and let's talk about symbolism in free verse poetry. I guess that's my transition for today. So I want to discuss the discussion blog that we had from Wednesday, where I had you guys answer that question. Should poetry rhyme? Do you think rhyming is a requirement for poetry, or do you prefer free verse poems where the poetry doesn't rhyme? And I have to say I was very impressed. I had kind of a very balanced position between you all. I think that there were a lot of you who advocated for poetry that rhymes, and then there were a lot of you who advocated for free verse. So that was really insightful and cool. For those of you who advocated for poetry that rhymes, you paid attention to how poetry that rhymes, it requires the poet to think a little bit more in terms of the words that they choose and the themes that they want to convey, because they are now limited or required to think within the parameters of that rhyming limitation, right? They can't just say whatever they want. They have to conform their ideas to structure and to a regimented pattern. However, on the other side of you who advocated for free verse, you made some excellent points in terms of how free verse, because it's not limited by the rhyming constraints, it's a little bit freer in terms of its ability to communicate theme and express complex ideas, which I have to say I agree with both ideas, where rhyming does force the poet to think a little bit more or harder in terms to conform their ideas to that rhyme scheme and that structure. At the same time, we definitely do see free verse poems dive much deeper in terms of its symbolism and its meaning. A lot of times, free verse poems are a little more abstract. Such was the case with A Noiseless Patient Spider, right? A lot of you identified how that poem, in that poem, the speaker kind of compares his soul to the spider that's reaching and trying to find its place in the world and to grab on with its web, whereas the speaker's soul is trying to find its place and find where it belongs and what it can grab onto. So that was very intelligent and awesome of you guys. So today we're going to be talking about Mirror by Sylvia Plath. As I've mentioned before, please, if you can, try to be reading along with the poem while we read through it together in this video lecture. If you can't, I understand. Okay, so if you can, grab your copies of The Mirror by Sylvia Plath. I am silver and exact. I have no preconceptions. Whatever I see, I swallow immediately, just as it is, unmisted by love or dislike. I am not cruel, only truthful, the eye of a little god four-cornered. Most of the time I meditate on the opposite wall. It is pink with speckles. I've looked at it so long I think it is a part of my heart, but it flickers. Faces in darkness separate us over and over. Now I am a leak. A woman bends over me, searching my reaches for what she really is. Then she turns to those liars, the candles or the moon. I see her back and reflect it faithfully. She rewards me with tears and an agitation of hands. I am important to her. She comes and goes. Each morning it is her face that replaces the darkness. In me she has drowned a young girl, and in me an old woman rises toward her day after day like a terrible fish. So I have to say, when it comes to the free verse versus rhymed poetry debate, I do hold a little bit more towards the rhymed poetry side. Not that I don't like free verse or I don't think that free verse is valuable. Just when I write poetry, it's much more enjoyable to me when I have to conform my ideas to that rhyme scheme. But I have to say, out of free verse poems, Mirror is one of my favorites. I have several favorites regarding free verse poem, which is proof that I don't hate it all. But Mirror has to be one of my favorites just because I think that it can be very relatable. You know, as a sin, we don't really think of vanity that much, and it's not something we're very aware of. Like, I don't think many of us would think of ourselves as vain, and not that saying you are, but a lot of times, especially in our culture where millennial, Gen Z, we've been raised with smartphones being accessible to us and the birth of the selfie culture, right? And so many of us, even though we don't intend to, spend a good portion of our lives looking at ourselves, and our reflections while we go throughout our day, right? Just quickly snapping somebody and being like, hey, what's going on? And just being very acquainted with our own reflection. And we have to be careful with that as Christians because, focusing on ourselves in any form, we're told, can be very dangerous, right? The model for joy is putting Jesus, others, and yourself last, but putting Jesus and others first, right? And that being the way that we can actually achieve happiness. And it's so true. When we focus on ourselves, we become miserable. And that's something that we see with this person in this poem, right? So let's go back to the poem a little bit. It's being told from the perspective in the first stanza of a mirror, and then in the second stanza as a lake. So rather than think of the personification in this poem being strictly a mirror, we could think of it as reflection in general, right? This force of reflection in these two different forms is personified, and it's making that connection with the woman in this poem, right? So in the first stanza, we have it as the actual four-cornered mirror, right? We see that in line 5, the eye of a little god, four-cornered. And this mirror is in the room of a young girl, right? We get that imagery in the line where it talks about the room having pink speckles and the mirror being across the room and being able to look at that wall and look at this girl as she grows up and see her. And I really love lines 1 and 2 where the mirror kind of establishes who it is, right? I am silver and exact. I have no preconceptions. Whatever I see, I swallow immediately. We have that personified metaphor there of swallowing immediately, right? The mirror doesn't lie. It doesn't pretend. It just takes the image and it puts it back and reiterates it back to the person. And it's not cruel. It's only truthful, but sometimes reality seems cruel, doesn't it? And that's something that I think this poem really addresses well. This idea that a lot of times we don't want the truth. We want to be lied to. We don't want to see ourselves for who we truly are. We want to believe the best version of ourselves. This is reinforced in the second stanza when the lake accuses the woman who she's watched grown from being a young girl to now an older woman. She accuses the woman of wanting to hear lies. A woman bends over me, searching my reaches for what she really is. Then she turns to those liars, the candles or the moon. I see her backed and reflect it faithfully. So whereas a reflection gives you a perfect image of what you actually look like, when we're in darker lighting, like we would be when we're bathed in moonlight or in candlelight, we don't see all of the imperfections. We only see almost a mirage of what we actually look like when we're drowning ourselves in darker light. And so the mirror accuses this woman of trying to see the best version of ourselves. I kind of hate to make this analogy just because it's so modern, but I think it's also effective in terms of understanding for many of you. How many times when you go on Snapchat or Instagram, you like to play around with the filter features, and the filter often takes away some of those less than desirable traits, right? You can go on Snapchat with, having just woken up and putting on a filter and you look really cute and you're like, oh, look, this is my real face, but it's not. It's a filter. And you're beautiful the way you are. You don't need a filter. But that's kind of a way to understand those lines about looking to those liars, the candles or the moon. This woman, in realizing that she's getting older and that she's losing her youth and that her reflection doesn't look the way that it used to or that she wants it to look, she's looking to now this counterfeit reflection, this reflection that doesn't give her an exact picture of herself, but the picture that she wants to see of herself. And so the reflection, the mirror in this poem, is kind of accusing her of wanting a distorted truth where it's been faithful to her, but it's been honest. I want to return to the line in the middle of the first stanza, the eye of a little god, four-cornered. At this point, if we were in class, I'd ask the question, why do you think they use the comparison of the mirror and God? And we'd sit there and we'd think about it. And in this evocation of calling itself, employing a metaphor that I'm a little god, it's not trying to necessarily be blasphemous in my opinion, in my reading, but it's talking about the omniscience of God, right? The God sees everything. And this idea of the mirror being like a little god and just sitting there and seeing everything and taking in everything and being able to reflect it perfectly. The emotions of this mirror are very interesting, right? It talks about the wall that's opposite, that it sits across from. It talks about the wall with pink speckles and having looked so long at it that it thinks it's a part of its heart. I always find that just so touching because, we think about the livelihood of this inanimate object and its whole purpose is to just sit there and reflect both literally an image, but reflect figuratively in what it's taking in. And then also in the second stanza, she rewards me with tears and an agitation of hands. I am important to her. She comes and goes. Each morning it is her face that replaces the darkness. So here is the woman who the mirror cares so much about because it's the face that the mirror sees every day. And the face that the mirror has been faithful to, it's been consistent, it's been loyal, it's only told her the truth about herself. But she rewards that mirror with crying, right? With that sadness about getting older and that realization that she's not going to live forever. And kind of how hurt that mirror feels, right? Of course, it's an inanimate object, but for the sake of the poem, the hurt that the mirror feels in knowing that she'll never be happy with it and reciprocate its affection. Because the reason why I would say that the mirror in this poem feels affection for this woman is that one of those last lines of the second stanza. Each morning, it is her face that replaces the darkness. And we get a line about the darkness in the first stanza as well. And this idea that it's the woman's reflection that the mirror gets to see and what replaces just this abyss of nothingness. And it means so much to her, or rather, the woman means so much to the mirror. Simultaneously, the mirror means so much to the woman, but they don't have the same relationship, whereas the mirror is always happy to see the woman. In different stages of life, people are only happy at some points to see their own reflection. And so, in the last line of the poem, we have a very interesting simile. I'm not going to lie, every time I get to this point in the poem, I'm just like, in me she has drowned a young girl, and in me an old woman rises toward her day after day like a terrible fish. So this idea that the mirror is now a lake in the second stanza, and in looking at her reflection while she's older, she's very disappointed. It would be like if someone went down that you really care about, and instead of them coming back up and being alive, out pops a terrible fish. I don't know if you've ever seen movies or if you've been fishing yourself where a fish pops up and it's smelly and it's gross because it's dead, and because fish that are okay are pretty much under the water, but when a fish pops up, it's usually dead. And so this could be a reminder of the woman's coming mortality and imminent death. That might be reading too much into it. They're like, wow, Miss B, the curtains are blue moment. Maybe. But we could interpret it kind of just as that reminder of what's coming, and that the aging process and not being able to retain that youth affects people emotionally. But I have to say, it's just so important to have a biblical perspective, especially as I'm not old, but I'm getting older in this point in life, right? And kind of just realizing that God has ordained different seasons of our lives, and that each season kind of comes with wonderful moments and also then difficult moments to adapt to. I remember thinking about being your age and thinking like, oh, I can't wait to be an adult. And I'm not going to lie to you. I'm actually one of the few teachers who might say like, I would never go back to being 13. But not because it's terrible, just because it was a different season and it had its own difficulties. And so when it comes to thinking about aging biblically, we have to keep in mind that this is the order that God has ordained. You know, because of the fall of mankind, we don't stay in a perfect state forever. And so aging is accompanied with our thoughts about death. But there are so many proverbs which talk about the importance of gray hair and how it's a symbol for wisdom. And I'm going to share a little secret with you. I have a couple of gray hairs, and I freaked out about them. But when we start thinking biblically instead of temporally, instead of thinking about this world which is fading away so quickly, we start thinking about God's kingdom. If I take that proverb literally, it's talking about how I've grown, how I have experience, and how I should be excited that I'm no longer as ignorant as when I was younger. Not saying young people are ignorant, but that I've grown in my maturity and that I've been able to learn new things and to have different experiences. And God gives each and every one of us different gifts during our different age groups, you know, different ways that we can grow in Him. And so my encouragement to you is to, when you think about aging, when you think about one day that you will be an old man or an old woman, because that is so very far off, to think about what you can do in this stage of life to prepare for that. You know, how can you get close to God now so you can have that elderly wisdom and that biblical wisdom that you can then pass on to the next generation, which might be your grandchildren, or maybe just people that you minister to at your church. Because if you ever read through the book of Titus, chapter 2, it enforces how older people are supposed to play a very integral role in the lives of the younger people of their congregation, how they're supposed to help teach and educate them in not just the ways of the world, not just the ways of the Lord, but also the ways of the world, and how to handle daily tasks and being a Christian and doing what is right in God's eyes. And so have that view. Don't think that this time means nothing, because the seeds you sow now as a young person, you'll reap those benefits when you're older. So try to attack every stage with that, idea of, what is God wanting to teach me during this time of my life? How can I glorify Him in the age that He's made me? And as many of you in our discussion blog for Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, you addressed how the Christian, when it comes to death, we have nothing to fear, because we've been given eternal life in God. And so death is just the enemy that we must have to face in order to be reunited with the lover of our souls in heaven. And so the same goes with aging, because aging often does eventually bring about death. We don't have to be scared about aging. This body is here today, gone tomorrow. And although they're all beautiful, we need to be people who ask ourselves, is my soul as beautiful as my face? Or am I as kind as I am pretty or handsome? And as God's people, I'm just reminded of that passage from 1 Samuel, when Samuel is anointing King David, and he says, man looks on the outside, but I look at the heart. And God looks at our hearts. And so let us be people who endeavor to focus on what our hearts look like. And the only mirror for how our hearts look is the way that we worship God and the way that we treat others. That's the mirror that we should be aiming to, and that's the reflection that we should be focusing on. How do we love God and how do we love others? And is the reflection of our spirit beautiful? Because, again, you are all wonderful and beautiful and fearfully made, but let us all have hearts that aspire to be beautiful like God's character. And that's what I'm going to end it with today. And I miss you all. I'll be praying for you. And just remember, Only a few more weeks. And then you've got this and you get to sleep. Yay! I can't wait to sleep. You can't wait to sleep. And we all can't wait to sleep. My dog's over there on my couch sleeping right now. She probably won't come over.